On the 6th of August 1628, a convicted witch was burned at the stake in Bamberg. Executions for witchcraft were not unusual in parts of Germany, with it being estimated that around 25,000 executions occurred there between 1550 and 1650. This particular execution, however, is very interesting because of the surviving evidence surrounding the interrogation and trial, as well as the exact nature of that evidence. Bamberg, a town in northern Bavaria in Germany, was plagued by a series of witch hunts in the 17th century, and there was a particularly acute panic between 1624 and 1630, which resulted in at least 900 executions. The prevailing view of early modern demonologists was that witches were the perfect deviants. They encapsulated the most dreadful parts of society. Witches were immoral, they were irreligious, and we see confessions, especially on the continent, of accused witches confessing to having engaged with a sexual satanic pact with the devil, gathering in mass orgies with other witches, copulating with the devil in the guise of animals and other such things. Their practices were highly unnatural. For instance, some of the accusations against witches were directed against midwives or wet nurses, whose subsequent murder and sacrifice of the small infants in their care flies in the face of what a natural woman ought to do. Their weather magic and destruction of crops is a further sign of their infertility and anti-nurturing behaviour. Witches were considered to be destructive and secretive and very antisocial. Their sabbats, or their nocturnal gatherings, were a direct attack on society at large, social control and church teachings. So, back to Bamberg. In the summer of 1628, the town mayor, Johannes Junius, was arrested and subsequently convicted of witchcraft and executed. To fully understand the accusations levelled against him, his interrogation, trial and execution, it's important to consider the context to his arrest. At the time of his execution in 1628, the 55-year-old had spent 20 years in politics, having risen from council member to a successful burgomaster. He was closely involved in city politics and, given the number of times he was elected as burgomaster, he was evidently considered competent and capable by his peers. His status would have given him a degree of wealth and influence in the town. Unfortunately for Junius, his life coincided with the tenure of the Vicar General Friedrich Furner, a powerful man who had the ear of the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Gottfried Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim. Furner adopted a zealous counter-reformation against the rise of the Protestant faith, and he was fiercely alert to any sign of witchcraft in the town, which he considered a devilish assault on Christianity. Furner organised rigorous witch-hunting commissions and strongly encouraged local officials to deal harshly with witches. He preached on the evils and dangers of the devil and encouraged people to accuse others of witchcraft. In 1625 alone, Furner gave 35 sermons on magic and witchcraft. Informants were rewarded financially, and the property of convicted witches was confiscated, a practice which can help explain why, in Bamberg, many of the accusations were levelled against wealthier citizens. Johannes Junius's dreadful experience began in April 1628, when Georg Neudecker, a 50-year-old burgomaster, was arrested and interrogated on suspicion of witchcraft. Under torture, Neudecker named Junius as a witch. Others too went on to name Junius as having attended sabbats or nocturnal witch gatherings, and he was arrested in June. He was imprisoned in the infamous Hexenhaus or witch house. Now, I mentioned that the case of Junius is particularly interesting because of the nature of the surviving evidence regarding his case. Not only do we have the official records of his case, but we also have a very special bit of evidence. On the 24th of July, Junius wrote a letter to his daughter Veronica, and it's likely he tried to smuggle this out of jail by bribing his guards. Unfortunately, the letter was probably intercepted because it was found amongst his records and it never reached Veronica. The letter, as you can see, was crammed onto a page using the margins as he ran out of space. The writing is cramped, and evidently he struggled to write due to the torture inflicted on his hands during his interrogation. The letter tells a somewhat different story to that recorded in the official trial records. In his trial records, it was reported that on the Wednesday 28th of June 1628, Johannes was examined without torture, and he rejected any accusation of witchcraft or attendance at the Sabbaths, insisting he is wronged before God and the world. He was confronted by his accusers, who swore to his face that he had attended witch gatherings, and he was given some time to think about the confession that he'd like to make. On Friday, the 30th of June, Johannes was tortured with thumb screws and leg screws, but he still refused to confess. He was stripped naked and examined for a witch mark, and his interrogators found a bluish mark, like a clover leaf, is thrice pricked therein, but feels no pain and no blood flows out. He was then placed on the strappado, which is a form of torture where the victim's arms are tied behind their back and then they're suspended from a rope with weights attached to increase the suffering of the victim. He still refused to confess. Finally, on the 5th of July, Junius is examined again, but without torture, and at last he begins to confess. He recounted that in 1624 he had lost 600 florins as a result of a lawsuit, and while he was sitting in his orchard feeling sorrowful, a maiden appeared and spoke to him. She led him by seductive speeches to yield him to her will, and after turning into a goat, she persuaded him to renounce God and to be baptised in the name of the devil. Junius confessed to attending witch gatherings, being transported there by a black dog who would appear to him at the foot of his bed on the nights he was summoned to the gatherings. On the 7th of July, he confessed that his paramour had ordered him to kill his son, but he couldn't do it and he killed his horse instead. And when he refused to kill his daughter, he was maltreated with blows by the evil spirit. According to the records, on the 6th of August, his confession was read out to him and Junius ratified and confirmed it before the court. Now, during his confinement, Junius wrote a letter to his daughter that was both poignant and revealing. He insisted that, "Innocent have I come into prison, innocent have I been tortured, innocent must I die." He confirmed that his handwriting was poor because of the damage caused by the thumb screws, and he told his daughter that he'd endured the pain of being drawn up and dropped on the strappado 8 times. He recounted that even the executioner begged him to confess to something, anything, otherwise the interrogators would continue with the torture until he breaks. Junius eventually confessed, but he insisted in his letter that his confession was entirely made up. His letter corroborated the confession he'd given to his interrogators, but he added in some detail not seen in the judicial records. He explained that while on the strappado, he was forced to name others in attendance at the Sabbaths. His interrogators coerced him to denounce specific people, including his friend and colleague Dietmeier, and Junius confirmed that those who had denounced him had sought his forgiveness before their own executions. He advised his daughter to hide the letter for the safety of both her and Junius's jailers, who would be beheaded if found out, and he encouraged her to leave the diocese for a time until the danger passed. He finally bade farewell to her, writing, "Good night, for your father, Johannes Junius, will never see you more." On the 6th of August, Johannes Junius was executed for the crime of witchcraft. A note found in his records suggests he was beheaded with a sword before being burned, a small mercy likely bestowed due to his status and confession, which he did not appear to publicly recant. The sad case of Johannes Junius is interesting because it gives insight into the judicial process through both official records and an unofficial personal record, an ego document. It tells us that witchcraft persecutions were motivated by a range of concerns, including religion, politics and social tensions, economic greed, power and so on. Junius's letter provides extra detail than that found in the judicial records, reminding us of the limitations of relying on a narrow source base, and the letter adds a degree of humanity and human experience not seen in the official documents. The sources tell us what drove innocent people to confess to the most dreadful crimes, and Junius helped to overcome his own guilt at having lied under oath by confessing the truth to his daughter. Johannes was but one of thousands wrongly convicted and executed for witchcraft. Bamberg's witch craze eventually subsided in the early 1630s, thanks in part to Emperor Ferdinand II, who insisted that all accusations be made public, banned the lucrative practice of seizing the property of convicted witches, and who spoke out against the events in Bamberg. Dr. Ferner, along with 2 witch commissioners from the city, Dr. Schwarzkons and Dr. Harsey, were forced to defend the trials at the Diet of Regensburg in 1630, and eventually the last prisoners were released on bail in September 1631. For Johannes Junius and hundreds of other victims, this came far too late.